In the pre-dawn hours of that 19th day of June in 1944, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, a young Japanese officer found himself contemplating thoughts that could have cost him his life. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiaki Irikin stood on the deck of the carrier Shokaku, which served as the flagship for Carrier Division 3, his hands shaking as he fastened his flight goggles and made entries into a private journal that no superior officer could ever be allowed to see. What he wrote down captured a realization that was both profound and terrifying in equal measure. The enemy they faced possessed capabilities that exceeded anything their training or experience had prepared them for. This wasn't simply a matter of numerical superiority in vessels or aircraft. The Americans had fundamentally transformed the nature of aerial combat itself. Every pilot climbing into his cockpit that morning, Irikin understood with crystalline clarity, was flying toward almost certain death. The darkness before sunrise revealed details that contradicted everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had come to believe after 3 years of seemingly unstoppable conquest across the Pacific. Irikin had spent time observing the intelligence reports, studying the intercepted signals, examining the radar returns that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. American radar systems were detecting and tracking Japanese aircraft at ranges that seemed almost impossible. Their own equipment struggled to identify targets beyond 50 miles, yet the enemy appeared capable of maintaining awareness of aerial movements at 3 times that distance. Even more unsettling was the brazen confidence displayed by the American task force. Every ship blazed with electric illumination, lighting up the ocean as if daring any attacker to approach. Their radio communications, when intercepted and partially decoded by Japanese signals intelligence, revealed a level of coordination in fighter direction that made the Imperial Navy's communication protocols appear antiquated by comparison. Across 9 Japanese aircraft carriers spread throughout the mobile fleet that morning, 430 of the Emperor's naval aviators made their final preparations for what their commanders had assured them would be the decisive engagement that would finally check the American advance across the Pacific. Among them sat veterans whose experience stretched back to that surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which had opened the war so dramatically. Others had participated in the sweeping raids across the Indian Ocean that had driven the British Eastern Fleet into retreat. Some had survived the brutal fighting at the Coral Sea. But alongside these hardened warriors sat replacement pilots who had barely completed their abbreviated training programs, young men who had never fired their weapons at an enemy aircraft or felt the terror of being hunted by hostile fighters. None of them, veteran or novice, could have imagined what the next 14 hours would bring. By the time darkness fell again, they would have witnessed the complete and utter destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. 346 carrier-based aircraft would be obliterated in an aerial massacre so overwhelmingly one-sided that American fighter pilots would joke about it afterward, calling it a turkey shoot as if they had been hunting defenseless game birds rather than engaging enemy combatants. The fundamental mathematics that would determine their fate had already been calculated, though not in the traditional metrics of tactics, maneuvers, or even numerical advantage. The disparities existed at a more basic level in the fundamental tools and training that each side brought to the battle. American radar installations could identify and track aerial targets at distances up to 150 miles. Japanese equipment functioned poorly beyond 50 miles, if it worked at all. American pilots arrived at their carrier squadrons after completing roughly 600 hours of flight training, a comprehensive program that ensured they were thoroughly prepared for combat. Japanese aviators, by contrast, were being rushed through accelerated programs that provided less than 100 hours of instruction before they were declared combat-ready. The aircraft themselves embodied these technological and industrial disparities. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat carried a 2,000-horsepower engine, heavy armor plating to protect the pilot, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without catastrophic fires. The Mitsubishi Zero, that legendary fighter that had dominated the early months of the Pacific War, remained essentially unchanged from its 1940 design, still fast and maneuverable but fragile, unarmored, and desperately vulnerable to concentrated gunfire. The roots of the impending catastrophe extended back through months of steady attrition that had slowly bled the Japanese naval air arm of its most irreplaceable resource, experienced pilots. Following the devastating carrier losses at Midway in June 1942, the fighting throughout the Solomon Islands campaign and the grinding aerial battles over Rabaul, the Imperial Navy had hemorrhaged veteran aviators at a rate that proved impossible to sustain. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, had been severely wounded in August 1942 and withdrawn from frontline combat. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, known to his compatriots as the Devil of Rabaul for his extraordinary aerial victories, had been killed in October 1943 while travelling as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft. The men who had trained together for the Pearl Harbor operation, that elite cadre of naval aviators who had represented the finest product of years of intensive training, were mostly dead now, killed in the hundreds of desperate engagements that had followed Japan's initial conquests. Among those preparing to launch on the morning of June 19th was Ensign Takeo Yamamoto, who had recently celebrated his 19th birthday and possessed a grand total of 82 hours of flight time. His personal diary, which would be recovered after the war from his surviving family members, provides historians with invaluable insight into the psychological state of these inadequately trained pilots as they prepared to face an enemy whose technological advantages seemed insurmountable. His entries reveal a young man struggling to reconcile the doctrine of spiritual superiority that his instructors had emphasized with the harsh realities he could see with his own eyes. His commanders constantly told him that fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that the warrior's soul could triumph over mere machines. But Yamamoto had studied reconnaissance photographs of American aircraft and found himself unable to believe these reassurances. The enemy planes were visibly larger, obviously newer, and present in overwhelming numbers. He asked a question in his diary that cut to the heart of the matter. How exactly does spiritual determination overcome radar systems that can see in complete darkness? How does willpower defeat technology? His instructors had no answer, because no answer existed. The intelligence information that should have warned Japanese naval commanders about their deteriorating position had been available for months, but the leadership had chosen to interpret it in ways that fit their preconceptions rather than accepting its disturbing implications. During April 1944, Japanese reconnaissance flights over American anchorages in the Marshall Islands had captured photographs of new carrier types that should have caused profound alarm. The Essex-class carriers that now formed the backbone of the American fast carrier task forces displaced 27,100 tons when fully loaded, and each vessel operated between 90 and 100 aircraft. Japanese intelligence analysts had identified 15 of these enormous carriers already in service, with additional vessels appearing to join the fleet on what seemed like a monthly basis. The implications were staggering, but somehow the full meaning never penetrated to the highest levels of command. Lieutenant Masahiko Okumiya served as air operations officer aboard the carrier Hio, and he had studied these reconnaissance photographs with meticulous attention to detail. In interrogations conducted after the war's end, he revealed just how limited Japanese understanding had been regarding what American industrial capacity really meant in practical terms. Japanese officers knew the Americans possessed more carriers, certainly, but they had failed to grasp the full implications of that numerical advantage. Each American carrier incorporated repair and maintenance facilities that exceeded anything available to the entire Japanese fleet combined. Damaged aircraft that Japanese carriers would simply push overboard to clear deck space could be repaired and returned to service aboard American vessels. A single American carrier possessed more maintenance capability and spare parts inventory than the entire Japanese mobile fleet. The Americans weren't just building more ships, they were building ships that were qualitatively superior in almost every measurable dimension. Commander Minoru Genda, whose brilliant planning had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible and who now served on Admiral Toyoda's staff, had been reading interrogation reports of captured American pilots with steadily mounting concern. The information that emerged from these interrogations painted a picture of pilot training programs that operated on an entirely different scale from Japan's increasingly desperate efforts. American pilots received 350 hours of primary training to master basic flying skills. They then completed 200 hours of advanced training in their specific aircraft types. Finally, they received another 100 hours of training with their operational squadrons before being considered ready for combat. Genda had written an analysis memo that never received the attention it deserved. If these numbers were accurate, and he had no reason to believe they weren't, then every single American pilot arrived at the battle with 5 times as much training as current Japanese aircrew. The Empire was sending children to fight against professionals. The mathematics were brutally simple and utterly unforgiving. The morning of June 19th dawned with clear skies and excellent visibility, the kind of perfect flying weather that would provide no concealment or protection for either side. At 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the Japanese mobile fleet from his flagship, the newly commissioned carrier Taiho, ordered search aircraft launched to locate the American task force. 30 minutes later, at 5 o'clock, Warrant Officer Sakai Manda was piloting a reconnaissance bomber when he spotted the first American vessels and immediately transmitted the sighting report that would set the battle in motion. What he reported was Task Force 58 under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, and it was enormous. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The entire assembled might of American naval power in the Pacific was concentrated in one massive striking force. At 7:30, Admiral Ozawa made his decision and ordered the first strike wave to launch. 69 aircraft formed up and began their attack runs toward the reported position of the American carriers. What those Japanese pilots could not have known as they flew toward their targets was that American radar operators aboard the battleship USS Alabama had detected their formation from a distance of 150 miles, giving the Americans an enormous advantage in reaction time. Admiral Mitcher's response was immediate and unambiguous. He ordered all available fighters launched. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had been designed from the beginning with one specific purpose in mind: defeating the Mitsubishi Zero. Every aspect of the aircraft reflected lessons learned from earlier encounters with Japanese fighters. The Pratt & Whitney engine generated 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 1,130 horsepower, giving the Hellcat a substantial advantage in speed and climb rate. The Hellcat carried comprehensive armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb battle damage. The Zero had neither. The Hellcat mounted 6 50-caliber machine guns capable of destroying a Zero with just a few solid hits. The Zero's lighter armament required sustained firing to achieve similar results. These advantages manifested themselves immediately when contact was made. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying from the carrier USS Lexington, would personally shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft during this single engagement, and his post-battle debriefing captured the essential character of the combat. The Japanese aircraft flew in predictable, tight formations that made them easy targets for slashing diving attacks. When American fighters dove on them from superior altitude, the Japanese pilots attempted to turn and dogfight, but at the high speeds generated by these diving attacks, the Zero's control surfaces became stiff and unresponsive. American pilots maintained their speed advantage, kept their altitude advantage whenever possible, and methodically shot down one Japanese aircraft after another. The mathematics of the first wave's destruction were brutal. Of 69 aircraft launched, 41 were shot down. American losses amounted to exactly 1 Hellcat. At 8:30 in the morning, Admiral Ozawa ordered his second strike wave to launch, and this represented the largest single coordinated carrier strike operation of the entire war. 128 aircraft formed up and headed toward the American task force. The American Combat Air Patrol had been organized in layers spanning altitudes from 17,000 to 24,000 feet, with fighter director officers using radar information to coordinate the movements of hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. This level of coordination was something Japanese forces simply could not match. Yeoman Second Class. Ito Takeshi served as a radio operator aboard one of the dive bombers in this second wave, and he survived the battle to provide his account of what became a massacre in the sky. American fighters appeared from every direction, always attacking from above, always maintaining the energy advantage that altitude provided. The Americans tore through the Japanese formation like predators attacking helpless prey. By noon, the second wave had lost 97 of its 128 aircraft. American losses amounted to 4 Hellcats. The third wave launched at 1000 hours with 47 aircraft. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Miyano, had been promoted to his command position just days earlier. His final radio transmission was brief and captured the hopelessness of their situation. Enemy fighters were everywhere. The strike force could not reach the target. The proximity fuse represented a technological revolution that Japanese forces had no answer for. This innovation in anti-aircraft ammunition meant that shells could detonate based on their proximity to enemy aircraft, rather than requiring direct hits. The effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire increased dramatically as a result. The fourth strike wave consisted of 48 aircraft launched at 1100 hours, but by this point coordination had completely broken down. 49 aircraft detached from their formations and headed for Guam to refuel, apparently believing they could regroup there. Instead, they flew directly into 27 waiting Hellcats that had been vectored to intercept them. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's highest-scoring ace of the war, described these encounters as completely one-sided. The Japanese pilots were essentially helpless. Throughout these attacks, American carriers maintained continuous flight operations for more than 12 hours straight, demonstrating a level of operational capability that Japanese forces could not approach. American deck crews could rearm and refuel a fighter in approximately 15 minutes, allowing rapid turnaround of aircraft. Japanese carriers required nearly an hour to perform the same operations, limiting the sortie rates they could achieve. As the afternoon progressed, catastrophe struck the Japanese carrier force itself. At 12:20 in the afternoon, the American submarine USS Albacore maneuvered into attack position and fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship. Warrant Officer Katsuki Komatsu had just taken off from the carrier when he observed the torpedo wakes heading toward his ship. In an act of extraordinary self-sacrifice, he deliberately crashed his aircraft into one of the torpedoes, destroying it and himself to save his ship. But the 6th torpedo struck home, rupturing fuel storage tanks deep in the ship's hull. Poor damage control procedures allowed fuel vapors to spread throughout the vessel. At 14:32, these accumulated vapors ignited catastrophically. The carrier Taiho exploded and sank, taking 1,650 men to the bottom with her. 20 minutes earlier, the carrier Shokaku had encountered her own nemesis. The American submarine USS Kavala had penetrated the Japanese screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. 3 struck the carrier, and the inexperienced damage control teams proved unable to contain the resulting fires and flooding. At 15:01, Shokaku exploded and sank. As evening approached, Admiral Ozawa confronted losses that defied comprehension. Of 430 aircraft that had launched that morning, only 130 remained operational. The mobile fleet's offensive capability had been effectively destroyed in a single day of combat. On June 20th, Admiral Mitscher made a controversial decision to launch a late afternoon strike at extreme range against the retiring Japanese fleet. 216 American aircraft took off and located the Japanese force. The strike succeeded in sinking the carrier Hio and damaging several other vessels, but the attack came at a cost. Returning in darkness, many aircraft ran low on fuel. Mitscher made the bold decision to order all ships in the task force fully illuminated to guide his pilots home, accepting the risk of submarine attack to save his aircrew. 100 aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, but only 76 aircrew died because the massive rescue efforts saved most of those who ditched in the ocean. The final statistics of the Battle of the Philippine Sea told a story of complete annihilation. Japanese losses included 3 aircraft carriers sunk, approximately 600 aircraft destroyed when land-based aircraft were included with the carrier losses, and nearly 3,000 men killed. American losses amounted to 130 aircraft and 76 aircrew. The exchange ratio defied historical precedent for carrier combat. Post-war analysis revealed the technological advantages that had made this outcome inevitable. The proximity fuse increased the kill probability of anti-aircraft fire by 700%. The F-6F Hellcat would achieve an overall kill ratio of 19-1 throughout its service. American radar could track aircraft at 150 miles, while Japanese radar struggled to function beyond 50 miles. In 1944 alone, American industry produced 96,000 aircraft, while Japanese factories managed 28,000. American aircraft plants operated continuously with multiple shifts. Japanese production operated sporadically, hampered by material shortages and increasingly disrupted by American bombing. The pilot training disparity proved absolutely insurmountable. American aviators received 600 hours of training before entering combat. Japanese pilots were being rushed through programs that provided under 100 hours of instruction. American carriers used steam catapults to launch aircraft, increasing operational flexibility. Japanese carriers relied entirely on wind over the deck for launch operations. American ships incorporated air conditioning and carried ice cream machines for crew morale. Japanese crews subsisted on rice rations that grew increasingly inadequate as supply lines were disrupted. Every aspect of the comparison revealed American advantages that Japanese courage and determination could not overcome. The radar gap proved decisive in every engagement. American SK radar systems could detect aircraft formations at 150 miles, providing ample time to launch and position interceptors. American fighter aircraft carried 4-channel radios with clear reception that enabled sophisticated tactical coordination. Japanese radios barely functioned and frequently failed completely, leaving pilots unable to communicate effectively with each other or their carriers. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report to Combined Fleet Headquarters read like an obituary for Japanese naval aviation. The first mobile fleet had ceased to exist as an offensive force. The carriers still floated, but they were empty shells without aircraft to give them purpose. Aircraft existed, but without trained pilots to fly them effectively. Pilots existed, but without the training necessary to compete against American opposition. American material superiority had proven absolute. Carrier warfare had effectively ended for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Commander McCampbell reflected in his post-war memoirs that after the Philippine Sea engagement, American carrier forces never again faced serious opposition from Japanese naval aviation. The real victory, he argued, wasn't simply the destruction of aircraft and pilots on June 19th and 20th. The real victory was destroying Japan's ability to train replacement aviators to an adequate standard. The training infrastructure had been so severely disrupted and the pool of experienced instructors so depleted that Japan could no longer produce combat-ready pilots at any meaningful rate. By the war's end, the production statistics told their own story. America had produced 141 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan had completed 7. American factories had built 324,000 aircraft. Japanese industry had managed 76,000. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war to become a Christian evangelist, wrote perhaps the most penetrating analysis of what the Battle of the Philippine Sea truly meant. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor with 350 aircraft, believing themselves invincible because they could project that much power across the Pacific. The Americans had lost more aircraft than that in 2 days at the Philippine Sea, without even pausing in their operations. Japan had awakened an industrial machine that produced military victories with the same efficiency that automobile factories produced cars. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that industrial warfare had fundamentally superseded traditional military prowess. Japanese pilots who flew into combat on June 19th were no less brave than the Pearl Harbor veterans had been. Their courage was not in question, but courage meant nothing when facing radar-guided Hellcats flown by superbly trained pilots who held every technological advantage. Lieutenant Commander Irakin's final diary entry, recovered from the wreckage after Shokaku sank, captured this truth with painful clarity. Japan had been defeated not by American warriors but by American factories. Every aircraft destroyed was replaced by 2 better ones. Every pilot killed was replaced by 3 with superior training. Japan had chosen to fight against American industrial capacity and had lost that contest decisively. The Americans had transformed war itself into a process of mass production. Japan had remained artisans trying to compete in an assembly line age. The sun had set on Japanese naval aviation in the waters of the Philippine Sea, and it would never rise again. The Hellcats that had destroyed nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in 2 days had accomplished more than winning a tactical victory. They had demonstrated that industrial democracy could produce military success as reliably and efficiently as assembly lines produced automobiles. The turkey shoot had ended. The age of industrial warfare, where victory was determined as much by factory output as by battlefield tactics, had fully arrived. Japan would continue fighting for more than another year, but after June 20th, 1944, the outcome was never in doubt.